The 14.4 TFT patch for Cyber City is the best patch of the set so far. It is balanced, it is diverse, and I'm actually having a lot of fun this patch. That being said, the approach to this patch has to be different. There's the usual rearrangement of what's moving up and what's moving down, but they also have some new system mechanics that you have to keep in mind as you play each game. Let's go ahead and dive into the TFT Academy tier list to find out exactly what we need to be doing to find success on this patch. One of the biggest changes they've made so far this set is that PV loot has been reduced. In general, there's been too much inflation this set, and so Riot decided to react by giving one fewer component and, in a few cases, even less loot orbs. And this is a big deal because as they lower the amount of loot that you get from PV rounds and from Scuttle Puddle and Crab Rave, that just means that you're less likely to get 3 items for your carry and your tank and have utility. You might build something like Sunfire and Spark, but then not have tank items for your actual frontliner, or you're just lacking actual items for your duo carry, so you're going to have like 3 items on one unit and 1 item on another. What this means pragmatically speaking as your first priority is that you should be taking more item augments. At 2-1, instead of taking econ almost every single time, think about taking some item augments that help you get power now and can help you win streak. This also means that item augments like Big Grab Bag are going to jump up in value, or even some prismatic augments that help get you some items immediately, so that way you can itemize your secondary carry. Point number 2 is that traits that give you resources like Cypher is going to be a lot stronger because you're going to have way more resources relative to the other players. This also works really well for Exotech as well because you get some free items. So Exotech is going to be a lot higher in value in a lot of lobbies. Tip number 3 is probably the most crucial, which is you have to slam your items and not greed them. A lot of people are going to be thinking, oh, if I save this bow, I'm going to be able to get like Last Whisper if I wait 3 more rounds for the carousel or 3 rounds for the PV drops. But because you get fewer components and less loot in general, you might be waiting for something that'll never come. And so by slamming aggressively, you probably will preserve more HP, and you're going to have to figure out how to play games without like the optimal utility or without the optimal items on your carry in general. You do want to care about your first item slam though, which is still really important. Based on the system changes that we just talked about, Anima Squad, for example, is a lot stronger this patch, mainly because you just need Leona 2 and Xayah 2, and you don't really need more items beyond that. Yeah, you do want to itemize things like Aurora later on, but you don't need to hit it before you get your first major power spike. Other compositions like Exotech we talked about will give you a lot of items, and you'll naturally be able to itemize your units way quicker. And that also applies to things like Vex if you go for the Vexotech setups. Hyper carry reroll comps can also be pretty solid because you pretty much just need the reroll carry and then 1 set of tank items, and you can compete with everything else. But these are much more situational, so don't just default into playing the reroll comps whenever you can, because I do think reroll is a little bit weaker this patch. Because if you end up playing things like these duo carry comps, such as Brand, Street Demon, Amp, and Aphelios, Marksman Vanguard, you're going to be a situation where you're going to have, 3 items on Brand, but then you have like 1 item on Samira, 1 item on Ziggs, and then 2 items on Nico, and then you're going to be struggling a lot to maintain good frontline and consistent secondary DPS. And that's going to be true of a lot of these compositions, so keep that in mind. I will say that this is generally a pretty flexible meta. The first item that everyone's going to be thinking about is slamming Rageblade because it's really good with Aphelios and Zeri, but I will say that I don't think that's the most flexible item this patch. In fact, there's 2 items that I want to call to in particular. I think Infinity Edge is actually really good because almost all your duo carries in every single comp will want to play it, or your straight up primary carry. In Street Demon, for example, you put this on Samira, and that actually works with Strategists AMP. In Marksman, or anything Marksman related, it's always going to be Xayah. And you can even put out things like Misfortune as your duo carry in a lot of these compositions, or primary carry your melees like Zed or Reroll. I think Infinity Edge is fantastic right now. I think that's probably my priority slam. Blue buff is also surprisingly really flexible. This might be some of the best blue buff has ever been in TFT for quite some time, in years. It's versatile because it's good on 2 4-costs like Vex and Annie. You can play a bunch of reroll carries that are specific around it, like Veigar or LeBlanc or even Morgana. They buffed Elise, and Elise is now also a viable carry. She might even be better than this B tier. She might even be in this A tier by the time this patch is done. And you can also play a couple of other niche outs like Yuumi with the Amp Nefiri, or even just putting blue buff on other units. Shojin is also still very flexible. There's nothing really wrong with slamming Shojin. Jack of all trades, master of none. Even the compositions that use Shojin, you can replace it with other things, but never a bad slam whatsoever. All right, with that breakdown, let's go ahead and jump into the tier list. The number one composition in the game, based on the data, is Street Demon Strategists, aka Strategists. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wasn't this nerfed? How is it still the best comp? Well, it wasn't that big of a nerf, and they did technically rework Braum instead of just straight nerf him. They made his paint bomb more consistent in terms of how long it takes to travel. So if it's on the other side of the board, like complete opposite, it doesn't take a couple more seconds to get to the other side. It just takes like a consistent amount of seconds. I think it's somewhere like I think 2 seconds now. And as a result, his DPS with it is much quicker, and it actually ends up being a slight buff to certain things like Sniper's Focus brand. Also, it's interesting because last patch, Street Demons were so contested that now when fewer people are playing it, they're playing it from better spots and they're more likely to hit. So instead of having like 3.5, 4 people playing Street Demon with 2 people bot 4ing, maybe you have 2 Street Demon players and both of them on average are doing better than like the 4-way Street Demon contest. So that's why I think the data looks better. But I think in reality, when you're looking at it in practice, especially as you continue to climb, Street Demon seems really good, but you can't really just play it the way you did last patch, which is like, okay, I slam a Shojin, I'm just going to force it, 7 Street Demons, steamroll the entire lobby on stage 4. But he pretty much just plays the same way, which is to look for Nico and Brand on level 8, try to see if you can get Nico 2 or Brand 2 before you push to 9. You might be able to get to level 9 on Nico 1, Brand 1 if you're very rich and far ahead. But, ultimately, you don't want to be stuck on 8. This is a composition where if you're stuck on 8, you're going to be in real big trouble. They also nerfed some of the other augments that are really good for Street Demons. So Climb the Ladder used to be 6, as it's written here, but now they nerfed it to 5. And they also nerfed things like Mana Zane, so it's a little bit worse on Brand. So small little hits here and there have made the comp a little bit less consistent and more vulnerable on stage 4 and 5. Also, your front line is still contested, even if you're not going up against Street Demon players, but people will play Nico and Strategist in other things like AMP, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I would still play Street Demon if you have like a good Desire 2 Dr. Mundo opener and good econ augments, or even just a good econ portal. So that way you can get to 9, unlock the 5 cost. And of course, you're going to be struggling with items, so please take some item augments like we talked about at the beginning of the video. Vex has moved down to the A tier, but that's just because Vex, I think the matchups got a little worse, and also because I think the front line for Vex is just harder to hit now across the board. Right now, a lot of people have caught into Vexotech, very good with Sejuani. You play 5 Exotech, and you replace Jax and Jin for Aurora and Renekton, and then go to 9 for Viego. This is like the capped version of the board. Don't really need to talk too much about it because I think people have covered it a lot in the previous videos, but a couple of small optimizations. The first is that Mordekaiser 2 with 3 items is more important than Sejuani. A lot of times what you end up doing with Sejuani is making sure that she can just get like 1 cast off, but Mordekaiser 2 is way more easy to hit and more consistent. So you end up putting like a lot of items on Mordekaiser first, and then giving left over to Sejuani, unless you have like true best in slot Sejuani, or you high roll and you hit Sejuani really quickly. And it's also because Sejuani's fighting Vexes for the number of tiers, so it's kind of hard to get so many tiers, and you even want things like Shiv, because Shiv is way better for Vex than it is for Spark to keep your Shred alive. And then there's another optimization about Vex. We found out Fishbones is one of her best artifacts because she can just straight up shoot the backline AoE and just punish people who are clumping their backlines. So very, very nasty if you're able to get it online. But the thing is, Vex is very flexible. You can play a lot of different front lines and mix and match different kinds of boards with Vex. One other variation that's doing really well in the stats is the newly buffed Divinicorp. Divinicorp Vex, they buff 5, 6, 7 to be stronger, and that just adds up so much because you just get a pile of stats and your frontline becomes really hard to deal with. And it doesn't have to be like, Cho'Gath, Urgot, and Jarvan in this spot. You actually have a ton of different options as long as you just play Divinicorp, activate Executioner, and then just play any kind of frontline. You can play Jax, Sejuani, and Varus, and then just play, vertical Divinicorp. You can also play Bruisers as a variation of Vex and then slide in more Divinicorp that way and a little bit less on things like Dynamo and Exotech. So you have like all these different things. What really matters is just getting big, thick, chungus idiots in front of Vex and just try to have them stall for as long as you can so that way you can gunblade everything down. So this patch, Exotech is going to be way more contested. Please don't feel like if you have Vex items, you have to be playing just exactly this core. She's way more flexible and dynamic and making her one of the more fun carries to play. The big downside with Vex is it's just hard to get items for her, so you often play Loose Streak because you kind of need specifically blue buff Gunblade, otherwise she's going to perform significantly worse. And that causes you to be in a lose streak, which causes you to roll way more aggressively and puts you in some difficult spots. So it's a trickier comp to play for sure. Strategists AMP is also coming back into the metagame, and it's pretty powerful to both play it as a reroll comp, a tempo comp, and also kind of hybridize the tempo and reroll. Let's first break down the tempo variation, which is to go to level 8, look for Annie 2 and Yumi 2, and then stabilize by not rolling too much, find a way to get to 9, and then look for Samira for 5 amp. The stats on 5 amp are bananas. 3.52 is like hotfix territory for a lot of normal things, but it's gated behind Samira, and it's really hard to get if you're ever stuck on 8 because you're behind or if you're just rerolling. So that's part of why it's kind of a fake stat, because it's gated by Samira, and the stats look worse if you filter out like all of the Fury 3s and the Yumi 3 stuff. But if you do end up getting to this board, a lot of times you even just 3-star Yumi as you're just pushing levels. Like you roll on 8, you roll down, you hit Annie 2, you hit Nico, you're ready to push to 9, and you collect like a couple of Yumis on the way up. All of a sudden you're at 9, you're rolling, and you find like 7, 8 Yumis. You're like, okay, I might as well go for Yumi 3. And all of a sudden your board explodes in power by getting Yumi 3 and Annie 3. That's more of the common way you play a tempo amp strategist board that just gets there. And you really want to focus on hitting 5 amp always. I see people take out Neferi and Italy, and they play things like Viego and Zach. And while that's not a bad thing, it's just that the 5 amp gives you so much extra charge power that it just supercharges the Annie and Yumi, and you really don't want to be losing out on the DPS. The other common variation around Amp is to reroll Neferi, and then as you're rerolling Neferi, you pick up copies of Yumi, and you start to see kind of a common thread where you don't really ever roll for Yumi as the primary. It feels like you're rolling for someone else, and you happen to pick up Yumi 3 in the process. And that's important because Yumi as the primary carry, she's okay, but you really want to either focus on having the whole team together by having Annie and Yumi and then find Samira, or you're power loading into Neferi as the reroll. I would say that the number one condition to open Neferi would be a really powerful artifact, and the two that come to mind is Spectral Cutlass and Suspicious Trenchcoat. Spectral Cutlass is really powerful because it teleports at the back, and Neferi, if she gets the cast off but teleports back, will finish the cast, and that's a chance to not only kill the target but assassinate someone next to it. And so you have really powerful Spectral Cutlass interactions with Neferi, which you can just assassinate backlines like Marksman or Brand very quickly and end fights right there and then. The thing about Trenchcoat is that you really need specifically Stairage Gauge and Edge of Night, because you might notice that all of these have once per combat at 60% HP trigger and do something, and that's very intentional. So Stairage Gauge and Edge of Night, very important to just keep Neferi safe, and so that when she splits, she gets maximum combat power. But it's pretty straightforward after that. Make sure you hit Neferi 3. A lot of times people roll on 6. You probably can roll on 7 if you are very rich and far ahead. And the roll on 7 is so that you can get Annie and Nico and maybe high roll Samira. But I would say that if you have, reroll augments like Starry Night and Shop Glitch, maybe just roll on 6 and just let the reroll augments carry you to a quick Neferi 3, then push levels and collect Yumi 3 over time. If you get a defensive X-Tech item that you don't even care about, like Repulsor Lantern or Chassis, I don't really care about playing Sejuani and Jackson in this spot. Just drop them and play other 5 costs that are high value. You could play Viego, get some Golden Knocks on Annie. You could also play Garen and get a strategist mod from Neferi or Samira. Both of those are really, really powerful. So don't feel like you have to play Exotech. It's just a nice little bonus if you can get things like Pulse Stabilizer and Hyperfangs. Neferi actually has a ton of itemization possibilities. We actually set up a guide where we talked about all different possibilities of it. There's basically a formula that you want to go with Neferi, which is you want to have a form of crit on your ability. You want some kind of omnivamp and evasion. And I basically sit here just yapping about all different kind of stuff, positioning tips, who should be your duo carry, how you end up doing a level progression. It's all right here. It's good stuff. And all you have to do is just click on the guide section of TFT Academy and look for the how to play Neferi. Marksman Vanguard is the most popular comp in the game, and it's just a really safe, easy, straightforward, fastball down the middle composition. This composition doesn't have a very high cap. It ends up losing to a lot of the other compositions in the final fights, but it's really good at farming seconds and thirds, and I think that's partially why people like it. It's also gotten buffed this patch because they buffed 4 Marksmen in particular. It gives even more AD. They also buffed things like the Marksman emblem, so we're probably going to add a variation, but you essentially just drop Jinx and you play Misfortune and you give her the Marksman emblem, and then you have Dynamo with Jin. And an MF is a really good user of things like the Marksman emblem because all of her bullets, I believe, count as the armor reduction. So ends up having some really powerful interactions there. The most common opener that you have from Marksman Vanguard is, well, I mean, a pretty good marksman like Kindred 2. You can also play Rapid Fire like Kog'Maw. They buff Kog'Maw early and just play some Vanguards. You also can just play Nitro with Kindred as well and transition that way. Just hold the Vanguards on your bench. And Bruisers are just really OP, and you can find ways to tie in some Marksmen and Bruisers, especially if you open up around Jhin, because Jhin is a dynamo that ties to Morgana, which ultimately ties to some Bruisers. The difficulty about Vanguard Marksman this patch, however, is that you are limited on the number of your items. And so because they're reducing the number of items dropped, like we talked about, you're not going to be able to hit things like Aphelios, Xayah, and Leona, and then have items for all of them unless you take item-based augments. So this patch, when you're playing Marksman Vanguard, things like Slammin', the reason why Slammin' is so good for this comp is because it gives you a component and it gives you econ. Think about taking all that shimmer. That gives you some items. And we're probably going to put more item augments on this recommendation chart because in reality right now, trying to play Vanguard Marksman without combat, without item augments is asking for disaster. But you might be thinking, wow, so you want combat augments plural and you want item augments plural and you still need econ? Like, how do you achieve all that? And that's why Marksman Vanguard needs to play from ahead, because the econ comes from win streaking. So you have the tempo and the HP and the gold for win streaking. So you can just take things like combat and items to make up the rest. If you're on a low resource encounter, let's say the encounter is augments shift earlier this game, or all augments are going to be gold tier. That's generally going to be like a low resource encounter. I would say that you would probably be thinking about Anima Squad in that spot instead. And it actually ends up playing similarly in the sense that you play Leona, Silas, Xayah, and you can play some marksmen with Vanguards. But you just end up looking for Aurora instead, and you don't have to even itemize them as much. Anima Squad is way better in low item situations and low resources because all that really matters is a very, very tanky Leona and some damage items on whoever's your backline, usually Xayah. I also had situations where I tempo with Seraphine too, right? I put items on Seraphine, I put items on Alawi, and then I never find Xayah because there's 3 Marksman Vanguard players. So I find like one Xayah, I end up itemizing Aurora directly, and I just carry Aurora instead. And I think that's also a possible viable way to do it because most of the damage from Anima Squad comes from the weapon, and that weapon deals damage the longer your team stays alive because every few seconds, those weapon triggers and just do a bunch of AoE. So TLDR summary is that Anima Squad, if you don't have a lot of items and you don't have a lot of resources, and if you do have it and you can afford it, try to play Marksman Vanguard instead. Zeri's becoming much more popular in the meta, largely because of her buffs to her directly, as well as her items, but also her dual carry. Misfortune is also a lot better. So in totality, Zeri Misfortune is pretty solid right now. I would say that this composition is actually slightly overplayed. I think people are just really excited to play Zeri again. They love slamming Rageblade. They see Marksman Vanguard contested. They see that they have Pulse Stabilizer, and they say, oh my gosh, let me just play Zeri. She's better this patch. I think this composition is even more dependent on having a lot of item augments because the way it scales your Exotech, and because you need to have Zeri and Misfortune and frontline items plural, because it's not just enough for Sejuani to hold items, you kind of want Mordekaiser to have items as well. So it feels weird because on the one hand, Exotech gives you free items. So you would think, oh, I should be able to play Exotech from this spot because it gives me free items and everyone's playing low item resource. But the reality is you actually need item augments even more because that's exactly what your trait scales off of. Outside of that, it's pretty much just a standard level A comp, similar to Vanguard Marksman, a Rageblade 4-cost holder, a AD burst, right? MS is Xayah, Zeri's Aphelios, Sejuani is Leona. So similar in that concept. And also very similar to Marksman Vanguard, you can have a 3-cost hold for the 4-cost. So, if you have Jinx for Aphelios and Xayah, Jinx can hold the items. In this comp, you can put items on Elise. Elise can be pretty solid because she can hold things like, you can give like Giant Slayer and Guardbreaker and other items, even Nvidia, until you hit things like Misfortune. Don't be afraid to mix and match. Exotech is actually surprisingly really, really flexible. Nitro is back in the metagame, and it's looking kind of good. Thanks to the buffs to the trait directly, they actually made the dinosaur, the T-Hex, a lot stronger. They also increased the scaling, so hitting a 3-star, I believe, gives you now an extra stack of Chrome, which helps it get to a critical mass quicker. And then they also buffed Elise, so all these things combined have kind of made it really nice to roll for. I think this Dynamo Nitro, or we call it Dynitro version, is the best because I think Elise 3 is really strong and solid. But you don't have to go for 3-star everything. I've seen people just go Elise 3, Shyvana 3, and Nidalee 3, and that's it. Or maybe they hit Kindred but never Nidalee. It's totally fine. I think Shyvana and Elise are the only truly important ones. And then if you're rolling for those, you might as well just have Jhin. Jin's a really good complement to Elise because Elise wants kind of like all the rods and tiers. So if you get bows and swords and gloves, you can just put them on Jhin. Not to mention, sometimes you get a free Exotech item, and that also is pretty good. You can also play Sejuani, Jax, and Neferi interchangeably as frontline. I like Mordekaiser because I do think Techie is nice, and Shyvana, Mordekaiser, Techie to nerf frontline damage is pretty solid, plus a little bit of extra stun. Scaling augments end up being really good for this composition. I really like no scout, no pivot, or investment strategy. This ends up making your Nitro just really strong over time. It is important to note that investment strategy doesn't buff the dinosaur directly, but buffing things like the Shyvana and Nidalee just repeatedly over time just ends up making it very, very difficult to deal with. But no scout, no pivot, man, this is bananas. I'm pretty sure this augmentation is way too good now. They buffed it from 1.5 to 2, so this is just a lot of stats over a large period of time, and it just ends up just becoming way too powerful to deal with. So I'm a big fan of no scout, no pivot right now, especially into Nitro boards. If you're looking for an alternative variation because you have good Nitro, but for some reason just the Jhin and all that stuff is not coming together, you don't think you can get to Elise, you can try the Nitro Veigar variation. It's also decent and pretty solid, but I do think that it's a little bit less consistent. For one thing, it feels like you have a big gap of power until you hit Kabuko. Like you're good for the first part of the game, then you fall off really hard until you find Kabuko, and from that period of time, you might die because who knows when you can hit the Kabuko. But if you ever find a way to guarantee Kabuko, the composition is very strong because 4-sided boss is pretty amazing. The nice thing about it is that Veigar ends up using very similar items to Elise, like Blue Buff and then AP or Gunblade. Like these are all interchangeable items with Elise. Like Elise could totally just play Gunblade here instead of Guardbreaker, and as long as you have like an AP source, yeah, you're going to be in a pretty good spot. Oh, one thing I didn't talk about for Nitro is that on level 6, you generally want to play 3 Nitro plus 3 Exotech instead of trying to greed for the 4 Nitro. I would just bench like Nidalee, for example, because you're not playing AMP, or if you don't really have Gen 2, just keep Kindred on the bench. Just make sure you have 3 Nitro and 3 Exotech if you're playing that variation. That is one thing nice about Nitro Veigar. You can just play 4 Nitro and Veigar Poppy, and you have the Cyber Boss. There's not really anything else you're looking for, so you don't have to play 3-3. You can play 4-2. We talked about it last video. Boombot Urgot is quite legit. It is very good if you can get to the end game board state, but to call it a fast 9 is actually underselling a little bit. It's almost like a fast 10 composition because it feels like you need to hit all of the 5 costs. Oh, and you also need a Cho'Gath too. The composition is really tough to pull off. You kind of need to be in one of those like triple prismatic. You start off with like level up, upper mobility, and you hit hedge fund in the same stage, right? Or you are on Scuttle Puddle and you have a way to get to Urgot and Cho'Gath and find a way to get Garen mods and find a way to get to Kabuko and, find the emblem. It's just like very expensive and intense. And because people are playing stage 4 pretty aggressively, rolling down for 4 costs, it's going to be really tough to beat people if you're stuck on Urgot 1, Cho 1, Garen 1, Vex 1. You're not really going to do much. I would say that unless you're really comfortable playing Fast 9 and Fast 10, or you're just unbelievably rich, I would try to stay away from this composition right now. It is A tier because if you get everything online, it just is Exodia. I've seen this composition have 0 combat, but just hit, Urgot 2, Garen 2, Kabuko 2, Cho 2, Viego 2, and just hit everything. And a Zac 2, right? For good measure. No Boombot emblem. They just crush over everything with 0 combat. That happens actually pretty regularly. It's just really, really hard to get there. So be advised, it's really powerful, but yeah, only if the stars align. Finally, let's talk a little bit about some of these like Zed variation comps. The first is Divinicorp Zed. They buffed Divinicorp, and if you can get the Divinicorp Zed, it's pretty solid. Zed just takes like, a bunch of double healing. Divinicorp gives him 1,000,000 stats, and he can just kind of solo the team alongside any kind of duo. The good thing is Renekton also got buffed, and if you get him to similar state as Zed, if you just get like BT, Edge of Night, Titans, Sterak's Gauge, things like that onto Renekton, him and Zed can just tag team and 2v9 like everything. Renekton's really good right now if you get him to an endgame state on a Divinicorp board. Send it with a duo carry here is just kind of nice to have. Don't feel like you have to itemize Vex. That might be one of the common baits. He just ends up being like nice to hold like anti-heal. The real big moneymaker outside Divinicorp and the Zed itself is Garen. If you can get the Divinicorp mod onto Zed, that's really OP. If you don't have the Divinicorp mod, then you probably have to put the emblem onto Zed. And that's just basically playing 3-item versus 4-item Zed, which is a pretty profound difference. Zed generally wants to be around like the second, third slots on either side. So A2, A3, A5, A6, so that he can jump to the back line. And also another augment that might subtly be very powerful is long distance pals onto Zed, because you can tag him with like a Slayer, give him a bunch of stats, and Zed will just absolutely murder everything. Turns into Faker. And of course, Cypher cash out into Zed Draven is still really solid as well. I actually played this earlier today, and it was a crazy game where it was like loot subscription. I kept getting support anvils, artifact anvils. I had like items on Zed 2, Draven 3, Renekton, Sejuani, Galio 3. I had like items everywhere. This is one of those compositions that you can pretty much use infinite items, and it really capitalizes on punishing other compositions that don't have a lot of items. As we talked about earlier, Cypher's just really busted in general. It just gives you a bunch of extra more resources over everybody, and you should be able to crush your way to the top as long as you hit this board. The quick rundown for anybody who didn't watch the previous video is you cash out, you look for 80 items on Draven, and you try to roll for Draven 3 on level 8. This composition is actually a level 8 comp. Going to 9 doesn't actually add that much, surprisingly. You can play like Zac or I guess another Divinicorp unit or something like that, but it's not really super valuable. So you go to 8 and you just roll on 8 almost for the rest of the game. And you'd be surprised how often you can hit like Renekton too if you just roll enough on 8, because not a lot of comps play him even though he's better. So Draven 3, Galio 3, Sedge, Zed, Renekton, just get all items onto them and win the game. We're dipping into B tier, but this composition has potential, and it kind of works off of what we talked about before. It's Elise Reroll featuring Braum as the front line and Misfortune as your duo carry. This composition has a lot of potential. It's becoming really popular in EU, and a lot of people love Elise Reroll. EU thinks she's one of the best comps in the game. We're still a little bit unconvinced, only because it feels like this composition is very gated around Braum 3. If you're stuck on Braum 2, it feels like you can struggle a lot. And also, it feels like you kind of need to have Elise with better items than in Nitro. In Nitro, it feels like you can kind of throw more flexible items since you have damage to the dinosaur. This feels like you have to have really good items on Elise, otherwise she's not going to primary carry. And the other element is that Misfortune is kind of contested. So because Misfortune is a much more important duo carry here compared to the Nitro Variations, the Nitro Variations plays around Jhin instead of MF. MF is a lot more contested this patch, and so it might be tricky, not to mention that you still might run into itemization issues because you're busy taking econ and combat. You definitely need an econ augment to hit this composition because 3-cost reroll is more expensive than 4-cost, so it's just hard to get it online. But if you're taking econ and you're taking items, you're not going to really have much combat, so you'll get outscaled. So that's where it kind of becomes a little bit tricky. But the potential of this composition is pretty high still. So I do want to give a shout out to this composition because I think the ceiling of this composition is potentially pretty high, and I think it's also not popular enough right now. Twisted Fate Reroll feels a lot weaker this patch. It is something that you can still play from time to time if you do have the spot and the items for it. I do think Twisted Fate's a little bit more reliant on best in slot now because they nerfed his damage. His damage was so high previously that you could just kind of mix and match different things like Rage Blade, Guard Breaker, and Jewel Gauntlet, or Rage Blade, Death Cap, and Giant Slayer. Now it feels like you kind of really want to actually have the good items on him, and you want to have a very good reason to play him, right? So like I think things like Exalted Adventure is like convinces you to play Twisted Fate, or maybe you pick Hard Commit and you get Syndicate Emblem and you have to play around Syndicate that game. Those are the games where I feel like I had the most success with Twisted Fate because the game is telling me to play it, as opposed to having one Rage Blade, one Twisted Fate, and just being like, okay, I'm Twisted Fate this game. I think those games are a lot less successful. Part of the reason why Twisted Fate is so strong was because he stat checks so many different compositions, but there were not a lot of comps that can keep up with his power. They buffed the weakest comps, they nerfed Twisted Fate's damage, and so he just doesn't really stay ahead for as long as he did previously. Still okay though, still a top 4 comp, and the stats look good, so if you're finding success with Twisted Fate, by all means, keep going for it. I want to give a shout out to Bruiser Reroll as well. I think Dr. Mundo is actually quite a demon. Disso keeps calling it Gorilla Reroll because there's like a meme on social media about like who would win, 100 men or 1 gorilla. And there's like a lot of surprisingly constructive debate back and forth about who would win. Dr. Mundo's the gorilla in this instance, let's be clear. He's one huge chungus gorilla. And if you get like the Warmogs on him, like I've seen people take Belt Overflow, and this guy just has like 10,000 HP. And when he flexes and just karate chops, he just one-shots things. And you can just put anything in the bag. You can play Zyra, Seraphine with Techies. I've had success playing Mundo with Morgana, and I've also played Morgana without Blighting Jewel and have success because I hit things like no scout, no pivot. If you do hit Dr. Mundo for whatever reason and you don't want to reroll, let's say you have Worth the Wait. Worth the Wait is not really a reroll augment. You're supposed to just like push levels while getting it naturally or get it off Build-A-Bud. You can just push levels and play a 4 or 5 cost composition behind it. You hit Dr. Mundo and you get Rage Blades. I've seen people play like Aphelios, Marksman with Dr. Mundo and Bruisers in the front. Maybe you play a Dynamo setup. Maybe you play Vex and Urgot, and then you're just playing some variation of like Dr. Mundo 3 with like Bruiser, Boombot, Urgot, Vex. You could do that. I just think Dr. Mundo is legit. Definitely really good with all those scaling augments, cooking pot, no scout, no pivot, investment strategy, so on and so forth. Couple other bonus ones. Long Crocodile. This composition got buffed. They buffed Renekton, so it's even better now if you're able to get to its top end and get to 6 rapid fire emblems specifically on Renekton and cook everybody as long as you can have a good enough front line. I would play this on encounters where you can get things like extra frontline, like golems, or let's say you have a wandering trainer with rapid fire and you get another rapid fire emblem. That's also a really good scenario. Things like Golemify and Dumbify are also really good. Just getting anything in the way of the stuff is generally A+. They also buff 4 rapid fire, so your mid game is better, and you don't necessarily have to even play for the Renekton immediately. Some people like play very all or nothing. They just like all in on 8. They roll down. If they miss Renekton, they just die. You can just like take it slow and play around Zeri and Draven and just wait very patiently for the Renekton and try to get to 9 by playing a consistent tempo game. If you don't find Sejuani, you can play like Mordekaiser and Gragas and just another unit and just stall out with 6 rapid fire plus frontline. Because 6 rapid fire does a lot of damage. The number one thing about this you have to make sure is that you don't build Rage Blade in this composition because you get so much innate attack speed on rapid fire. It's pretty bad. So instead, build damage items or utility items, things like Gunblade, Red Buff, Last Whisper. Those are all pretty solid as well, on top of like Deathblade, Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer, so on and so forth. Due to the amount of CC, Quicksilver ends up being pretty good right now in the meta. You can also put healing on Renekton, which is really good, but feel free to just like slam any kind of offense and just make sure Renekton can survive. Couple things before you go. Wolf Unchained Silas is looking pretty good. They buffed it specifically this patch, and I think Anima Squad is better as well for the reasons we talked about. It seems to be doing a lot with a little. So Silas with Titans, BT, and Jewel Gauntlet looks really good in the stats. You can pretty much just like play Silas and Leona and then start slowly itemizing Xayah and Aurora with just leftover items, and eventually over time find a 3-item duo carry. That ends up probably being the most success. So definitely keep your eye on for Wolf Unchained. I also want to give a shout out to Button Mash Poppy Hero Augment. They buff Bastions, so Bastions are a little better at the top end. And if you can find a way to get to 6 Bastion with 4 Cyber Boss, this composition actually has a really, really high ceiling. For a 1-cost reroll, it actually pops off a lot in its win rate, as long as you can get to the 5-cost. The tricky thing is, the 5-cost Bastion is Renekton, the 5-cost Cyber Boss is Kabuko. For a 1-cost reroll to bank on the 5-cost, it's really hard to get there, but the potential is really high. So if you can find a way to like hit the Poppy very quickly because you play it from a good spot and push levels, get to 9, find a way to get to Renekton and Kabuko pretty smoothly, then everything is going to look really, really good. So this augment is insane if you can get it rolling, and definitely keep a lookout for it. And that might tempt you to hold on to Poppies early. I do want to say don't do that unless you have like good items to set up for Poppy. You don't want to just hit Poppy 3 quickly. You also want to hit items for Poppy. So if you have like sword and a cloak and, you know, a vest, maybe start thinking about holding Poppy pairs if you know that it's not going to be like gold or prismatic. So yeah, you can give it a try if you get the setup for it. Whew, that was a lot to cover, and that was about like 60% of the meta. There's still a ton of comps and variations we didn't mention. I think, you know, like Techies is viable. Some 2-cost reroll we didn't mention, like Slayers or even playing around Golden Ox. But all that you can check out on the TFT Academy tier list if you want to find more information. I just want to tell you what are the best comps that are currently performing, and a lot of things I'm open to specifically that I'm having a lot of success with, as well as Dish Soap. I actually think this patch is really good. I'm enjoying it a lot. I'm actually going to try to see if I can climb it seriously to join the big boys up in the 4 digits. So I'm going to try to assert myself and see how far we can go. Thanks for watching. Good luck on your climb, and I'll catch you guys next time.